Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios, and I'm happy to welcome those of you who are watching or listening to this podcast episode in Two Pews in a Pod. Today is the first of 3 planned episodes around the theme of surviving and living after the death of a spouse. And I am joined for this conversation by 2 wonderful members of our congregation here at Evangelical Lutheran Church. I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Dee Dee Bowman.
I'm Sandy Brown.
And I'm also going to ask that you would begin whatever you feel comfortable sharing, just to help those who are listening or watching know a little bit about the story that brings you to this conversation. Tell us about your spouse who died and when and how that happened.
My husband, Mark, died about a year and a half ago. It was unexpected, an accidental death. He was living with Parkinson's. That I'm sure contributed to that. Death isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. And for us, the when was very much a surprise.
John Eugene Brown was
Reverend Doctor.
Okay, right, but he was just plain John to me. He started not feeling good in January of this year, developed bronchitis, was in the hospital briefly, came home, and then I could see that he was failing. He was asking for help for things that he always did on his own. By the beginning of March, he ended up having to go to the hospital again, and from there he went to Autumn Leaf or Glade Valley nursing home. And at that point, I was there for about 3 days, and then I was exposed to COVID and couldn't visit John for 5 whole days. My friends were wonderful and came to see him, but on March 18th, Monday, I was able to spend the entire day with John. And when I left, I said I'd see him in the morning, but they called me and said that he had died that morning.
And this was not the first time you've lost a spouse.
No, I have. My second husband also passed away, and he had Parkinson's disease. But we were married quite a long time, 20-some years, and John and I only had 12 wonderful years together. So the grieving was different in each situation.
And excuse me if you mentioned this. How long, did you say how long you and Mark were married?
We were married for 43 years.
Yeah. We were talking before we started to record this episode about something that I want all of the people who are watching or listening to hear. This is so important to keep in mind, and that is that every person experiences grief entirely, uniquely in their own way. And it's important to help people realize that, because sometimes adding to the pain and the burden of grief is an expectation that people may carry that they ought to be feeling or thinking or doing what other people have felt or thought or done when they've been living with grief.
Or shouldn't be doing.
Or shouldn't be doing or thinking or feeling. That's right. You ought to feel this way, or you will feel this way. And for any of us, the way we experience grief is completely unique.
It is, and when Mark died, there was a neighbor who reiterated that. Encouraged me to grieve as worked for me and to put aside kind of those expectations that others may have in terms of what your grief should look like. At the same time, my adult children, I'm sure, had expectations of what grief was supposed to look like. They are wonderful individuals and very supportive of my journey and supporting me in that. But yes, absolutely. You do you, I think, when it comes to grief.
That's a good way to say it, Dee Dee. You do you.
You're not going to wear black for a year.
I don't want to feel that
Right.
for
Yeah.
that long.
Right. I felt that the grieving that I did when I had time to grieve at that point was only feeling sorry for myself and not for John, who was very faithful and very committed to his religious background and his interest in God and his waiting to get to heaven to be with all his family and friends again. So it was only me feeling sorry for me.
I was thinking earlier today, there's a phrase in one of the litanies that is sometimes sung at worship here in this congregation and in other congregations. We say or sing a prayer asking God to deliver us from an evil and unprepared death. And as I listen to you talk about this, I wonder, would you say, I'm inclined to say, but I don't want to trespass on your perception, John did not die an unprepared death.
I believe that. He was ready. He had told me in the fall, I'm dying.
Yeah.
No, you're not. But he knew that things weren't exactly right, and he was always prepared to meet his maker.
It's not an if question.
Yeah, not an if, but a when. And you said that Mark's death was quite unexpected.
It was in terms of the timing, but I too feel like he was ready whenever that time may, well, and he had said to me, I'm ready whenever that time may come. Death is something we had talked about. He had prepared a funeral service or bits and pieces of a service that he wanted included. So while I don't know exactly what happens when you die, I do know that it's good. Those promises of faith I hold very dear, and that's enough.
Let me ask you to talk a bit about how your experience of grief, especially this grief over John's death and Mark's death, how your experience of grief has changed over time. And I'll ask you first, because it's been a little longer for you, a year and a half roughly since Mark died, only half a year since John died.
It is. For me, grief is something that I carry. Initially, it was very sharp and jagged in my mind. I pictured it as very sharp and jagged. With time, I still carry that grief, but I feel like the edges have worn down a little bit. It is not as sharp. It's not as raw as perhaps it felt at the beginning. I certainly think of Mark every day, or something will happen that brings Mark to mind, but it's not a bad feeling. It's fun to remember.
That's really important.
Yeah.
I think remembering is important. At the time John died, I was busy moving my sister into my home from her home. She had been there 17 years and was asked to leave. So John invited her very kindly, would you like to live with us? And she was thrilled. So while John was actively dying, I was busy actively trying to deal with my sister's move. So I didn't have a lot of time to sit and think and grieve. And though I know John's gone, he's very much with me. I look in a chair and I think he's going to walk into the room in a moment. I miss him mostly in the nighttime when in bed we had our best conversations and talking. He always encouraged me to examine my faith, which I didn't think I needed to do. But I'm really very sorry and regretful that I didn't do that while he was alive, because I am more actively reading scripture and looking at things, and I just feel bad that maybe he knows that I'm doing it now, I don't know, but he certainly was a guide to me in that direction, and I'm very grateful for that.
I think grateful is an important word. As I look back after some time has passed, I'm in a different season of my life than I was as a wife and a caregiver. And I'm very grateful for both of those times. But I think specifically in the years of my marriage, I look back now with very grateful eyes.
It's interesting to me to hear you describe it that way. My wife and I have spoken about death. I mean, we don't linger on it. It's not our favorite topic of conversation, but we've talked to each other about, what would our hopes, our intentions be in terms of service, in terms of the other one and their life, and to think of it as a different season of life. I find that full of hope and helpfulness, because it suggests that you're not leading a diminished version of your life. You're leading a different version of it. But I don't want to put words into your mouth.
No, I feel very strongly that way. That, the seasons change. And we don't necessarily choose when the seasons change or how the seasons changed, but this is a different time.
Yeah, as you said, it's not an if, it's a when.
Well, when your spouse is ill, as you said your husband was, you may be the right physical time, but it's never the right time. It's always, I want more time. I wish you were still here, that sort of thing. I was comforted very much by a group of church members who were studying a book called Don't Sing Songs to a Heavy Heart. And at the time we were reading that was when John died, so I said to them, now you can practice on me. So if you say the things that they tell you shouldn't say, it's okay.
Yeah.
Because I am not
Because
critical.
they were there and
Absolutely.
saying something.
Yes.
Yeah.
And being there, either talking or just being there, reaching out to you, bringing you muffins, or sitting and talking to you, or sitting and listening, or saying nothing at all, and just being there is very comforting.
Showing up has great value that I appreciate now more than ever, I think. And even though we say the wrong things or maybe do the wrong things, whatever that may be, the intent is always good.
And who says it's wrong? It's how you accept the gestures that your friends and your family give you. And I was very fortunate to have fabulous support.
Absolutely.
What you asked just now, who says it's wrong? And that's a good point. It's easy to be perhaps overly judgmental about what is the right or the wrong thing to say. Nevertheless, although I have never experienced the death of a spouse, I've experienced other losses and other difficulties in my life. And I know that for me, however well intended, I have always felt highly resistant to what I think of as the careful interrogation, being approached with questions that I need to respond. How are you doing? How are you feeling? And I know that I've asked those sorts of questions myself. I try to be mindful of the fact that that can feel intrusive to me, but to others it may not.
Well, and I think, at least for me, grief is awkward. And somebody else's grief can feel awkward for me. So even when the wrong things are said or those kind of more intrusive questions are asked, I think it's a result of everybody kind of being a little uncomfortable and wanting to reach out and not quite knowing what to say. So that, again, the intent is to reach out and offer some comfort, regardless of how that may look in the moment.
I may have said this before, but someone once said, grief is the price you pay for love. And I find that very true.
Yeah.
And even though John and I had only 12 years of knowing each other, it was a wonderful relationship in that he sort of completed me. And the things that he was strong with, I was weak, and vice versa. But when you find someone who completes your life, as I said. It's extremely comforting, and very much do I miss all that. And so I think that you have to go on with the other things in your life and just, as you said, carry that with you, but don't let it burden you.
Well, thank you both for your time in recording this episode, for what you have shared with us. We are, as I said at the beginning, intending 2 more episodes in this theme, in this topic. We'll talk about some other matters related to the experience of grief over the death of a spouse. But for now, I'll say thank you for what you've shared. Thank you to those of you who have listened or watched. I'm Paul Baglios.
I'm Dee Dee Bowman.
And I am Sandy Brown.
And we'll see you next time.
This has been 2 Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.